Thank you. Let me begin first of all by thanking Victor for inviting me to this incredible dialogue, and I'm really grateful to you. Except that I was going to tell you all this: my speech is going to be a hit and run operation, because as soon as the session finishes, Rob and I are running to the airport to catch a flight. But let me begin by saying that the subject of today's discussion is supposed to be trade tensions and techno-nationalism. I guess I've learned a new word, techno-nationalism. I didn't know it existed. But this is not about trade tensions and techno-nationalism. This is part of a much bigger, and I think I said this to some of you earlier today, that is absolutely no doubt that a very broad-based, wide-ranging geopolitical contest has already broken out within the world's number one power, which is the United States of America, and the world's number one emerging power, which is China. And in some ways, how do you say, the gears have been locked already, and the motion is starting, and what you're going to see unfolding, sadly, is a major geopolitical contest in the next 10 years. And that's why, as I mentioned to some of you, I've just written a book on US-China relations. We published in New York in April with the provocative title, Has China Won? And there are two key messages. And basically, the key message of the book is a paradoxical one, that a major US-China geopolitical contest is both inevitable and avoidable. And actually, I'm also going to talk a bit about the avoidable part. But it's inevitable because, unfortunately, whenever a number one power is about to be surpassed by the number two power, it will do whatever it can to suppress it. It has happened for 2,000 years or so. So it's very logical, rational behavior on the part of the United States to thwart the rise of China. And it's being played out, and I must emphasize this, in so many dimensions, in the economic dimension, political dimension, military dimension, cultural dimension, also in what I call the primacy dimension. So the techno-war and the trade war is a very small part of the big game, but it's a critical part. And at the same time, I also want to emphasize that things have already become nasty and will become more nasty. I just happened to read, probably yesterday, President Trump spoke at the Economics Club of New York. And you can see the language he uses, you know. And he says that, on the one hand, he says that there's a deal coming. Then he explains this is why a deal is going to come. He says China is having the worst year in more than half a century. Their supply chains are cracking very badly. And they are dying to make a deal, Trump said. But we are the ones that are deciding whether or not we want to make a deal. Now, if you use this kind of language, which is clearly nasty and condescending, and you saw this in the speeches by Vice President Pence also, you get a real sense of the emotions also that are driving it. And so if you want to understand what's happening, you cannot just focus on the technological war. You have to look at the big picture. But from the big picture, when you drill down to what's happening on the technological front, my key message to you is that, in the 10 minutes I have or so, is that the subjects are both politically and ethically very complex. And I say this because quite often what is portrayed is that this is a simple black and white contest between good and evil, right and wrong. And what I'll try to bring out, if I can, is the complexity of these things. And so I'll start, obviously, with the most obvious and biggest source of the technological dispute between United States and China, which is the actions that United States has taken against Huawei, right? It's China's biggest, there was some action taken against ZTE, but that's been resolved, but now we are in the big fight with Huawei. So what is going on in this Huawei fight? So if you read the American narrative, what is happening in the Huawei fight is that they believe that since Huawei at the end of the day is nothing but an extension of the Chinese government, Huawei therefore carries, when you install Huawei equipment, you're giving a backdoor to the Chinese intelligence agencies. And so if any country buys Huawei equipment, United States will reduce its dealings with that country because they say, you're allowing Chinese to spy on you. Now, I cannot personally, there's no way I can assess whether or not Huawei has a backdoor or whether or not Huawei is being used by Chinese intelligence agencies. Obviously, I don't have the resources to do that. But the fundamental question is this. Even if it's true that Huawei has a backdoor and is being used by Chinese intelligence agencies, the fundamental question then is, ethical question is, should you just ban equipment that only comes from China that allows spying, or from every country that allows spying, right? And as a philosopher, it's always a question of how do you apply the universal rule. So are you saying that all countries should stop spying? Then if you're saying all countries should stop spying, we know from Edward Snowden, who's revealed it to us, that the United States has the capacity to pick up every telephone conversation in the world. And initially, I thought it was just picking up metadata. Actually, the United States doesn't pick up metadata, it picks up data. So if it is ethically okay for the United States to pick up every phone conversation in the world through its equipment, why is it ethically not okay for the Chinese to try to do the same? What's the ethical difference? And then you discover, of course, the assumption behind that is that whatever a liberal democracy does, by definition, is ethically okay because liberal democracies are good. But if a country is run by a communist party is by definition evil, and because it is evil, whatever it picks up is ethically wrong. Right? You keep drilling down and you get to the deeper assumptions. Then the rest of the world, of course, has to make then a decision. Is it only okay to cooperate with liberal democracies? And is it ethically wrong to cooperate with communist party systems? And then the situation becomes even more complex if you look at it in terms of their behavior and accountability, right? How do these different systems perform ethically, right? And the remarkable thing, if you compare the performance of the, let's say, the United States system and the Chinese system in terms of improving the well-being of their people, which is at the end of the day what you define whether a system is good or bad, the United States is the only modern developed country where the average income of the bottom 50% has gone down over a 30-year period after 1980. By contrast, the bottom 50% of China have seen the greatest improvement ever in their standard of living since Chinese history began in the last 30 years. So you have a system that is performing extremely well in terms of improving the well-being of the bottom 50%, and a system that has basically damaged the well-being of its bottom 50%. And you say one is ethical, one is not ethical. I bring this dimension to you to tell you that when people say it's a very simple case of yes, whatever liberal democracy does is right, whatever communist party system does is wrong, it's not so simple to explain. And at the end of the day, behind all these efforts to what I call to try to demonize China in some ways, there is a political impulse that's driving it. is not just being driven by other factors. So that's in the Huawei dimension. Now let me turn to another. I'm going to go to some very sensitive dimensions, and please forgive me. I just learned that only yesterday or 2 days ago, the company in China that manufactures the largest number of drones in the world has just been put on a blacklist in the United States. And it's been put on the blacklist in the United States because they say this company's equipment is being used to suppress Uyghurs in Xinjiang. That's the justification for blacklisting of the drones company. And maybe it is, and maybe it's justified, and so on and so forth. Again, I don't know. But if you say that suppressing Muslim minorities and killing Muslims is ethically wrong, and I agree that killing Muslims is ethically wrong, if you had to answer a very uncomfortable question, which is which country kills more innocent Muslims? How many people have died as a result of the bombings that have taken place since 9/11? And I'll just give you one statistic, okay? Obama is one of the most peaceful presidents ever. In the last year of his presidency, the United States dropped 26,000 bombs on 7 Muslim countries. And you can imagine how many innocent Muslims died. So if you're saying, and I come back to my same universal rule, that if you're saying what is being done in Xinjiang is wrong, and I'm sure what's done in Xinjiang is wrong, what happens to what's happening to the other Muslims? And how do you apply the same universal rule to American companies that may be involved in the supply of equipment that may be killing Muslims elsewhere? Again, I'm just bringing out the ethical complexity. Now let me turn to another dimension, somewhat different, but also a very key part of what you might call the data information war, right? Now in this area, as you know, and yeah, I'm talking about social media, there is no doubt that China has built a firewall. It is basically, I think effectively, China and North Korea are probably the only countries that are keeping out Google, Facebook and all, and China has developed its own WeChat, Baidu, and so on and so forth. And I think one can then, of course, discuss whether it's wise or unwise for the Chinese to do that, and I'm sure China is paying to some extent some economic price, some political price by not being part of the sort of the more universal Google, Facebook system, for sure. But then when you come to the discussing about the spread of Google and Facebook around the world, it has both positive effects and negative effects. And you know, a few months ago, I gave my first and only TED Talk in Vancouver. But the first person to speak at our session was an amazing English woman. Her name was Carol Cadwallader. If you ever get a chance, please watch her TED Talk, because she documents in amazing detail how Facebook was able to transport outright lies into the Facebook accounts of various people. And that's why this vote on Brexit swung. So these were lies that were being told that led to a political disaster. And she said nobody could regulate Facebook. And when she, as a journalist, tried to get the lies, she couldn't get them. The lies had disappeared in the social media. Now, what's the reason why I bring this up is that in many countries, Brexit, you saw one result. If you have Facebook or Google, which is unregulated, spinning around the world, right? Is it just purely bringing good Or is it also challenging, disrupting societies through fake news and other ways? And then if I want to bring another ethical dimension in about data and the spread of data, why have Facebook and Google made such incredible profits, right? Principle is very simple, access to data. And ironically, the data is often going from poor countries to rich countries. And then the huge profits goes to the rich countries. Is there an ethical question involved here where how can the poor countries that are giving their data away get a share of that data? And this is going to become a bigger and bigger question, because we've just seen the beginnings of this data revolution, because right now I think only about half the world may have smartphones, but I think within 10 years the whole world is going to have smartphones, and the amount of data that's going to come out is even more and more. The question then is, who has the right to harvest, who has the right to use, who has the right to make economic value from this data? So therefore you begin to see there are very big questions involved here, and then you also understand why the Chinese built a firewall and said, hey, we want to be able to control what we are doing in this area. So what you therefore see in what is called a trade and technology war has got far deeper political and ethical dimensions. And you've got to be aware of the political and ethical complexity of these issues when it comes to passing judgments on who's right, who's wrong in this area.